You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. Evictions of tenants who haven't been able to pay their rent because of the pandemic may resume in October. Advocates say this is a public health issue.
Our statewide moratorium prevented over 160,000 COVID-19 cases and 6,000 deaths as of November.
They're also urging tenants to apply for rent relief money, and not only because it'll help them pay back their rent.
That will be your defense if your landlord tries to evict you. You do have that defense. If you prove that you can qualify for rent relief,
there is assistance out there, and you have every right to look for that assistance, to ask for that assistance, and to get that assistance.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic. It's never a good time to get evicted, and looking for housing in the Bay Area is always hard. But the pandemic has put a lot of renters into particularly difficult situations.
I have seen many informal evictions happening through illegal termination notices and forced moved outs. I have seen an increased number of stories of tenants being intimidated.
That's Betty Gabaldon, a Contra Costa tenant organizer at the East Bay Alliance for a Sustainable Economy. You might have heard them called eBase.
Just also want to share that my daughter and I also suffered the trauma of being uprooted from our home. I was worried that I was going to be homeless. It's very hard to find a place out there. They ask for so many requirements, such as earning 3 times the amount of rent, the first and last month, deposits. And just to search for another place requires days of missing work. Moving your stuff out requires time and money. And even when me working 2 jobs, that's not enough.
Betty's organization is part of a coalition of dozens of tenant, legal aid, and public health groups raising the alarm about the end of the state eviction moratorium. It expires at the end of September, and these organizations are saying a wave of evictions is a public health problem.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Jones. I'm the executive director of BARHI. BARHI is the coalition of the Bay Area's governmental public health departments. Years ago, we held a retreat for the 9 Bay Area County health departments, and we asked them what issues were most shaping health in the region. Among the top of those issues was housing affordability. Concerns have only gotten worse during the pandemic. Today, about 1 million Californian adults are behind on rent, and 80% of those live in households with children. The eviction moratoriums that are now expiring have mattered greatly for health. Research led by Dr. Kathy Bleet estimates that our statewide moratorium prevented over 160,000 COVID-19 cases and 6,000 deaths as of November. So we come to you today with a clear concern about the end of the housing protections that have been saving lives throughout the pandemic.
This isn't an unfamiliar warning. We've even talked about it before on this show. Eviction protections have been scheduled to expire before, and then they've been extended. Is there really not going to be another extension, another stay of execution? I put that question to a group called Tenants Together.
Hi, I'm Shanti Singh. I am the Communications and Legislative Director for Tenants Together.
Hi, my name is Lupe Arreola. I'm the Executive Director for Tenants Together.
Is it for real this time?
Yes. So here's the thing. There has been an ongoing eviction crisis. It's not going to come all at once. It's not going to be like a tidal wave that recedes and then comes right back in. I think the big difference now, as of October 1st, is that 2 very key things are going to be missing. One is going to be the lack of the federal moratorium, CDC moratorium, that the Supreme Court recently struck down. And then 2 is a lack of non-payment protections for tenants in California, which was one of the main things that we were able to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that it's more, they're kind of trying to foam the runway, the legislature and Newsom are, rather, in terms of trying to make it more of a slow roll eviction crisis than an immediate one that might, say, alarm the public or the press. We're going into a very difficult, complicated, uncertain situation with, over the next 6 months.
And just to be clear also that President Biden actually came out and, said after the Supreme Court struck down the CDC eviction moratorium that he directed state and local governments to enact additional eviction protections to protect tenants after the CDC moratorium was struck down. We're just telling Newsom, 1, keep your promise, which he said that 100% of back rent was going to be covered, basically, in one way or the other. And two, we're saying follow the guidance of President Biden.
What do you think is going to happen to renters when this state moratorium expires? Because it doesn't sound like you guys think the work is done.
No, it absolutely isn't. Initially the rent relief money, they were very confident that it was going to go out swiftly. We still have tenants, who are waiting months and months and months for rent relief. There are also tenants and landlords who don't know about the program. Because they didn't want to extend eviction protections, at least to the point where the majority of the rent relief was dispersed, which, keep in mind, it hasn't been. The majority of it is still there, still sitting there, despite all these applications piling up, etc. They don't want to continue extending protections. That's really the first piece of it. And so they're unwilling to continue protections until the rent relief is dispersed because it didn't go out fast enough. And so what they've done is created this sort of period where if you are a tenant who is eligible for rent relief, you may still be protected from eviction over the next 6 months to the end of next March. But you basically have to make that case in court. And that's where it gets really hairy because the majority of tenants before the pandemic did not have access to legal representation. For every one lawyer in California, there's like 5,500 low-income Californians.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're relying on tenants to first, go to court. A lot of tenants simply just leave, right? They get that notice and they're intimidated.
So is that what you expect to see come the beginning of October? Just a flurry of eviction lawsuits?
Yeah, I mean, it might be, we'll see how much it's, does everybody file at once? Does every landlord in California file at once? I don't necessarily think so, but what we're going to see is essentially a months-long slog, if I had to guess. We should be concerned that our already resource-constrained court system is also not going to be able to handle what comes, and that we're going to see, successive, smaller waves of evictions happening over the course of several months through the fall and into the winter, possibly even into the spring.
We are in a situation that very few people who are still living have ever been in, right? Which is that we've been in a pandemic for the last year and a half at least, almost going on 2 years. I think our legislators and local officials definitely have this sense of there's a beginning and there's an end, right? At some point we have to end the aid. At some point we have to end these protections. A virus doesn't work that way. A virus mutates. A virus becomes something else, something even more dangerous. And so at this point, we're kind of almost in diverting paths where our legislators are saying, we're going to reduce assistance and we're going to reduce protections because the threat is diminishing. And also you have this virus, which even though we have vaccines, which have been instrumental in decreasing the risk to people, you still have a large portion of people that are not vaccinated. You still have breakthrough infections, even for those of us that are vaccinated. So there's definitely still an increasing need of ensuring that people are not having additional exposure by having to be either homeless or having to be looking for housing, and potentially also still having a depressed economic state. What we need right now is not really how any of us are used to working, and that there's a beginning and there's an end to a specific set of protections. It's a virus is not going to work that way. And, I wish that they would see it as this is a long-term crisis that we're going to continue dealing with for at least the next few years.
To recap, if you haven't been keeping track of every twist and turn in the state and local eviction protections, here's where we're at now. If you live in San Francisco and you're unable to pay rent due to the pandemic, you're protected from being evicted over rent that you owe from October 2020 through September 2021. But only if you pay a quarter of that rent. If up until now you haven't been able to pay even a quarter, you've got to pay that by the end of September. And rent for October is 100% due and 100% evictable if you don't pay it. So what can tenants do? The main thing organizers are saying is if you're behind on rent and you make less than 80% of area median income, apply to the rent relief program. All right, so you both, and I think a group of other tenant advocates and public policy groups, are encouraging people, first and foremost, apply for rent relief, which there is a program through the state. We can go into the details, but you're saying apply for this rent relief. Why?
That will be your defense if your landlord tries to evict you. And you can, in fact, go to your landlord or go to court. And again, this is for all the reasons I highlighted before, not enough, but you do have that defense. If you prove that you can qualify for rent relief, and that doesn't mean that you've had to receive the funds yet, but if you're in the system, you have a much better chance of fighting any kind of bogus eviction that your landlord may be throwing at you. It's important to kind of, we are providing the reality to the rhetoric, but I do want to emphasize that the rhetoric that is coming out of Sacramento, out of the Capitol, is no tenant who is eligible for rent relief, which means that you are behind on rent and you make under 80% of the area median income. Those are the only federal requirements, right? They're out there promising that any tenant who is eligible for rent relief will not be evicted for non-payment over that debt. We're challenging them to put their money where their mouths are here. But, if you're a tenant, you should know in California that that promise has been made to you. Obviously, how that plays out in reality is what we're really concerned about. But that is what is out there. And so we don't want to tell tenants to completely give up. We want to tell people, get in the system.
This is especially important for those people that cannot pay the 25% of their rent before the end of the month. Because if you are not able to pay 25% of your rent before the end of the month, and you submit it, also your declaration stating that you've been impacted by COVID, and you apply for rent relief, then if the landlord tries to evict you for non-payment and takes it to an unlawful detainer in the courts, the fact that you've applied for rent relief and could be eligible for up to 100% of that back rent means might be your only true defense, other than potentially habitability issues, any other bad acts by the landlord. But kind of one of the only clear things that's laid out in AB 832, which is this most recent set of COVID-19 protections that ends September 30th, is that if you've applied for rental assistance and you have a pending application and you have an eviction case that goes to court for an unlawful detainer, then they cannot decide on that unlawful detainer until that petition has been processed.
It's a bit hard to gauge the need for rent assistance. We don't know for sure how much money renters in California or even in San Francisco owe in back rent. The city's legislative analyst tried to make a really educated guess using unemployment claims data. At the low end, they estimated over the course of 15 months of not paying rent, tenants in the city have racked up collective debt of more than $147 million. At the high end, the estimate is roughly $355 million, so quite a range. And where we fall on that scale matters because, like Shanti and Lupe just described, you're protected in eviction proceedings for the next 6 months if you've applied for rent relief and your application is pending. But if the money runs out, you may be out of luck. Back in July, I talked with Ora Prachovnik about this. She's Director of Litigation and Policy at the Eviction Defense Collaborative.
If we're around 140, 150 million, we probably can do it. Mm-hmm. And if we're at 340, 350, 360 million, there's not going to be enough funds for all the rent that's owed, and evictions will go forward against those who were denied assistance, not because they weren't eligible, but because the funds ran out.
Someone can get evicted even though they qualify for this rental assistance, not just because they can't pay the rent, but because additional protections were supposed to be extended to them because they qualified for this assistance. But if they qualify and the money isn't there, then they can't get the protections?
That is sadly exactly correct. The wording of 832,
which is the
new state eviction protection law, which allows evictions to commence in October, basically has a process where those eviction proceedings that move through the court, the term in the court is called unlawful detainer. That's the word for how a lawsuit moves through the court to evict a tenant. Mm-hmm. Those unlawful detainer actions cannot proceed unless the landlord could show that they've applied for rental assistance through one of these government programs and been denied.
The landlord has to show that, or the tenant?
Initially, the landlord has to show that, and if they don't show it, the summons won't even issue. So that's great news. That's one of the wonderful things that 832 does that I mentioned. I have some happiness about some of the parts.
Right, yeah.
So in the past, tenants had to come forward and assert defenses. Now the landlord has the burden to prove that they've been denied rental assistance after good faith efforts to obtain it, or they can't even get their summons. Mm-hmm. Should the landlord have the summons issued, let's say there might be some landlords out there that aren't entirely truthful, the tenant can still assert the defense of saying, I have applied for rental assistance and my application is pending. And once again, the court has to stay the proceedings, and not stay is a legal term meaning like delay, don't let them move. Those legal proceedings will be stopped until the tenant's pending rental application has been dealt with. So that's all good news. But the bad news is once there's a denial, the eviction could go forward. So why might there be a denial? There might be a denial because the tenant's not eligible. Maybe their income is way too high. To be eligible, they need to be 80% or lower of what's called AMI, adjusted median income. There might be a denial because the landlord completely does their application and the tenant ignores it and doesn't take part. And to be fair to the landlords, we're allowing that eviction to go forward, and the statute has set a 15-day deadline for the tenant to do their part of the application. And there might be a denial because the rental assistance program says, sorry, we ran out of money.
So in other words, yes, you're being evicted. Yes, your income is low enough that you should, by rights, get rental assistance. But because there isn't any, sorry, you're getting kicked out anyway.
That's correct. So it's upon all of us to make sure that doesn't happen. That might mean at the federal level, we need to cause that next crunch that I referred to. That has to come forward. Or here at the state or local levels, we either need to produce more rental assistance money or change the laws because of how inequitable it would be to evict tenants in this situation.
Another complication? Because there were, and still are in some cities, separate state and local rent relief programs that people applied to separately, it was tricky to keep track of how close we were to running out, how much money renters in San Francisco have applied for, and how much has been distributed. Enter the Rent Relief Tracker from the San Francisco Public Press. Here's my colleague, assistant editor Noah Arroyo, who put that together. Why track rent relief?
Knowing how much how much measurable rent debt is in the city is useful for a lot of things, like knowing whether or not we need to kick more money into these programs. Mm-hmm. The problem when we started tracking this about 7 weeks ago was that there were two rent relief programs, and they were working in parallel. This big bureaucratic mess, we don't need to get into it, but the state was running one and the city was running one. Mm-hmm. And if you wanted to know how many people in total were applying for this money and how much they had requested, you needed to get this information from both places. And of course, neither level of government was combining these figures for us.
Right.
So for us to answer that question, someone had to do it, so we chose to do it. That becomes relevant in a conversation about what is the need. Now, we have about $152 million, some of which is for administrative costs. That is the amount of money that is set aside for San Francisco renters. We wanted to know at Public Press, we wanted to know, well, how much money do people actually want? And obviously, that's a moving target as people apply, week after week. Right now, we're at $132.9 million that San Francisco renters have applied for. And out of that, $41.2 million have been approved or the checks have been cut to go out to them. If you were to look at applicants as opposed to dollars, then we can say that more than 1 in 3 applicants have gotten money.
Has anything changed about the way that people are applying, or does anything stand out to you about the figures and how they've shifted over time?
When I look at the last 7 weeks, I'm not seeing any major shifts. There's a pretty clear trend line, and the increase in requested dollars, it picks up speed, slows down from 1 week to the next. There are fluctuations, but the overall trend is pretty clear. We look at the amount of dollars that have been approved so far, and it's a fraction of what's been requested. But actually, I think in the end, what we're going to see is that almost all requests are approved. So if the amount requested is approaching that 152 million mark, then that's an indicator that we are actually going to run out of money.
Yeah. And who needs to know about that? I mean, I don't think that you're putting this information out there to discourage tenants from applying for rent relief, right? Who are you hoping will look at this and see, oh, we're getting close to the threshold here?
I think politicians need to be paying attention to this. So San Francisco cannot set up its own eviction moratorium to replace the state's when the state's phases out. But the thing they can do right now is they can set aside money to go into the rent relief program and raise that ceiling from 152 million to something else.
You can find that rent relief tracker for San Francisco on our website, sfpublicpress.org. But let's go back to the experts here. Do they think the money is going to run out?
What has already been happening in cities like Oakland and LA and Anaheim, Irvine, is that in those cities, the applications submitted have already surpassed the amount of funds that's available in those cities. And so what they've done is they're turning over their applications to the state to say, here, state, we've encumbered already all the money that we have, basically. So even though we haven't processed it, so now you, state program, need to process the remaining applications. So that's already creating a backlog at the state level. Additionally, the last count, we saw only about 18% of applications received had actually been funded with the state's ERAP program, which is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So that means that not just do they still have 82% of applications outstanding, but they're also going to be getting an influx of applications from other cities that had their own programs, but whose money has basically kind of run out because they've received more applications than funds. We're concerned that that's going to create even a bigger backlog at the state level. That means that, people are going to be waiting longer for any kind of assistance. And it's also going to create confusion. We are concerned that people are going to fall through the cracks if they don't hear back about their application and they don't know that it's been sent to the state ERAP program instead of their local program, for example. Yeah. We are concerned that the money is going to run out at the state level, even though supposedly once after October 1st, there's going to be like a reconsolidation of like money that has not been spent, that is going to be redistributed amongst the cities with the biggest need. But even though there's some algorithms and kind of formulas to how that's going to happen, we don't know how that's going to shake out in terms of how much money is actually going to be available and whether we're going to get additional money from the federal government. So this is why, again, it's really important that people apply now. Because if they wait until after October 1st, again, we don't know how much money is going to be available. We actually don't know how the courts are going to be processing a lot of these cases. And we don't know, again, how many more applications the state is going to be receiving because local governments have basically are tapped out.
Right. So just to be clear, could I still apply to the rent relief program after September 30th?
Yes.
Okay.
People can still apply after September 30th. You will still have some protections, the same protections, at least for eviction if you apply after October 1st. But again, the later you apply, the lower down on the queue you are, considering again that over 80% of applications are still pending at the state level. Mm-hmm. That means yours is added to the bottom of the pile.
And what do you tell people who are waiting for word about their application?
We tell them to be patient. We tell them that they've done everything they're supposed to do to be able to access this assistance. We tell them that they should actually contact either the state's ERAP program, which has a phone number, or they can go, every city and county has at least one local organization that is being contracted with the state to provide assistance. So we're saying go to your local organization that's helping to process these applications and ask for an update. Because many times we're waiting for our local government or state government to respond, and they're waiting, and sometimes some additional information is needed, and they may not know that. Because what we're seeing also is that sometimes people will have missing information in their application, and they will not know that because they got an email and it went to their spam folder, or people don't check their email frequently, or most people don't answer a call that they don't recognize. And for whatever reason, if they don't respond within a certain amount of time and their application's not completed, then their application will be closed. And that means that they will
How long?
You get about 15 days to respond and provide all the necessary information, and they could potentially close your application.
Good Lord. Check your spam folders, people.
Yeah.
And do you get anything other than an email? Do they, will they call you if you don't use email?
Depends on the information you provided in the first place. But, it's also, this is kind of also where we get into other issues like language barriers, lack of internet access. Not everybody has a smartphone or an email address ready to go. It goes into the issue of having a lot of barriers to entry.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we definitely tell people, if you get a call or if you get an email, respond as soon as possible. Because many times it's information you could maybe easily get, or there needs to be like clarification in what you submitted. Everybody's family is different. Everybody's home is different. And so sometimes it'll be something as simple as like clarify how old this person is, in your home
Why
or
do they
something
need to
like
know
that.
how old my kid is or whatever?
Well, it usually depends on how many adults there are in the home.
yeah,
That's
okay.
usually what it's based on, in terms of like whether you qualify under the income level, 80% AMI. I mean, honestly, we've seen applications being held up because, someone was in a domestic violence situation and their spouse had to move out because they were the abuser. And so basically they're like, hey, you have to give us the income for your spouse and your spouse has to sign. And it's like,
you're like, I
my
can't do
spouse
that.
is an abuser who
Yeah.
I kicked out.
Yeah.
So it's like, there's definitely like that level of like lack of understanding also as to like what's happening with people, what always is happening with people in terms of like people are going through stuff now more than ever. And, sometimes I feel like there hasn't been that understanding from the state program or really most government agencies that something like that could be happening and that somebody's application is being held up for that reason.
Oof, wow. Where does the money go to? Does it go to the tenant or to the landlord if it's rent relief?
I mean, it can go to both at this point, depending on who initiates the application. That was an issue before, where there was not a direct-to-tenant option, even though I guess I'll sound like a broken record here. Once again, something that tenant advocates had been pushing for as a backup if the landlord was not complying for a long time. But now that is the case and has been the case for the last few months, where the tenant if the tenant applies directly and obtains the money, they have 15 business days to pay that to their landlord, but the tenant can apply directly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
And actually, the landlord does not have to cooperate. So if a tenant applies and the landlord refuses to cooperate, they can still get that rental assistance, and then they'll be responsible for paying that forward to the landlord, which is a huge change that, like Shanti says, we've been fighting for because that was a huge obstacle to people even really moving forward with rental assistance.
It's not just renters that these advocates want to spur into action. The state law that created this moratorium that's about to expire had another factor. It preempted local jurisdictions from creating new moratoriums on eviction for non-payment of rent through the end of March 2022. But there's still a lot that local governments could do.
We're asking local governments to expand their local just cause protections because it's going to help protect a much broader breadth of tenants than the current protections that are at the state level, even post October 1st. So what that means is increasing protections for tenants that are being evicted because of owner move-in, that are being evicted because of substantial rehab, which are the two that we've seen a rise in the last year and a half. Also, if tenants are being evicted because of Ellis Act, because there's a state law that allows a landlord to quote unquote go out of business and take that building off the rental market, which again has really led to a lot of speculation and a lot of flipping of property.
There's a few places like Richmond in the East Bay, Long Beach, Los Angeles that have passed during the pandemic, not temporary, permanent tenant anti-harassment ordinances. And that's also one thing that we are looking at that, is not preempted by state law that local cities and counties can do right now. Because what we've seen is an uptick in harassment. And what we're going to continue to see, because the rent relief program issues have not been resolved, is we're going to continue to see situations of harassment between tenants and landlords. And so passing those ordinances is also something critical that can be done right away, and that a few municipalities have already stepped forward and done.
I want to leave you with this message from Lupe and Shanti to those who are struggling with debt or being behind on rent and worrying about eviction, and who have generally fallen on hard times.
It's not because it did anything wrong. It's not because they didn't work hard enough, or it's not because they didn't save enough for a rainy day. We've been hearing a lot of these talking points coming out of not just the landlord lobby, but also from our own government, our own officials, right, who, say like, well, we've given you some money and why couldn't you make do? Mm-hmm. We need to recognize there was already a huge systemic institutional inequalities before this pandemic, and they were just really exacerbated by this pandemic. I've seen so many cases of people who just are distraught that they have not been able to provide for themselves and their family, that is something very heavy to carry around. So just kind of want to tell people, it is not your fault that this has happened. This is a pandemic that has impacted the world, and there is assistance out there, and you have every right to look for that assistance, to ask for that assistance, and to get that assistance. And, everybody should know that they've worked for that assistance, and they should really take advantage of it, because it's not going to be around forever. And just, do that with no shame, because we've worked for it, we've earned it, and now it's time to call it in and be able to use that assistance to stabilize yourselves and your families and pay off that back rent.
I'm going to paraphrase a little bit David Diane from the American Prospect, because he was writing about the failure of rent relief programs. Is the point of rent relief programs was to stabilize communities and stabilize people as quickly as possible to prevent a massive homelessness crisis. It is not about creating an arbitrary system to determine which tenants or which Californians are worthy or unworthy of staying in their homes. There really has to be that kind of paradigm shift in how we treat these programs and the welfare state in general, which has been broken, for decades. And now this pandemic is really bringing those issues to light.
Thank you both so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having us.
If you're behind on rent and want to apply to the rental assistance program, the site is housing.ca.gov. You can also call to apply at 833-430-2122. If you're facing eviction, call the Eviction Defense Collaborative at 415-659-9184 or send an email to legal@evictiondefense.org as soon as possible. The organization advises tenants to respond within 5 days of being served with court papers to avoid the risk of a default judgment against them. And if you're curious what else this coalition of tenant, legal, and health advocates are advising cities to do, you can read their 8-part set of recommendations at barhii.org/8actions. And before I go, there's one other thing we didn't get into today. It's called shadow debt.
We've spoken to so many tenants who they've taken payday loans, they've taken loans from families, they've maxed out credit cards, they've foregone necessary expenses, they've used all of their stimulus and unemployment checks, et cetera, all of the above to be able to cover their rent. And there are no programs right now in place that would cover that sort of shadow debt, is what we're calling it.
And the thing is, if you went into shadow debt to pay your rent, well, your rent is paid. So the rental assistance programs won't help you. Organizers are paying attention to this issue, though, and they're working to figure out ways to address this. We'll get to that on a future episode. For now, I'm Laura Wennis, and you've been listening to Civic. Civic comes to you from KSFP-LP at 102.5 FM in San Francisco. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Our team includes producer and contributor Mel Baker, and assistant producer Liana Wilcox. KSFP is a project of the San Francisco Public Press, a nonprofit investigative newsroom. Find our reporting at sfpublicpress.org. Thanks for listening.